Good evening. Hi, and thank you everyone for joining us on this Friday evening for our books presentation titled The Rise of the Dutch New Right. As many of you will know and be very familiar, my name is Vivian Zichel. I'm the Research and Programs Manager here at Kunstinstituut Melly. And I'd like to start by saying some words of appreciation to the Erasmus University College Rotterdam and Robin van der Akker, who are our partners in presenting this evening's program. We also in the building have a busy double program with a spoken word collaboration downstairs. So at the end of the program, we'll be having a little bit of some Prosecco and drinks in this room. Usually we would invite everyone downstairs, but as you see, we've got some flutes set up behind in the space where if you're very nimble, you also might be able to purchase a copy of Neoliberalism, a book which is co-authored by our key speaker tonight, Merijn Oudenampsen. So, as I've said, tonight's books program welcomes the sociologist Merijn Oudenampsen to address, not this book, which is in fact in Dutch, but another book, a recent Routledge publication called The Rise of the Dutch New Right, in which he makes the very compelling argument that the post-2002 Dutch New Right swing is best understood not as a political style, but as an economic idea. Thank you. And no, we have a slightly flaccid mic problem. I can, maybe while you find a solution, I can continue holding it. Thank you. So here at Kunstinstituut Melly, we've come to have a slightly specific and unique interest in the structures of Dutch social politics, particularly as they came to be shaped through the late modern era of the 1870s. This was the time in which our neighborhood was developed through a program of urban renewal, and in which the Witte de Witstraat was formed, and it coincides with the emergence of pillarization, the Dutch neo-Calvinist anti-revolutionary movement, and a phase of nation building, the establishment of the organs of the late modern Dutch nation state. Through our name change process and through research such as you see outside with the Rotterdam Cultural Histories Project, and through artistic projects such as that by Michiel Houben, who is with us, who investigated the architecture of the building, we came to understand that the unnaming of our institution from the former namesake, Witte de Wit, did not only concern a 17th century colonial horizon, the so-called Golden Age, but also a more recent 13th century nation-building phase, including the institutions of education and culture, of which we are part. The topic of tonight's presentation on the rise of the Dutch New Right has, of course, only become more relevant since the Italian election of Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy party. It's an election that has shocked some parts of the commentariat into speaking no longer of populism alone, but of fascism specifically. And so once again, it's a highly necessary time to reflect on the specific socio-political formations of far-right movements in their contextual specificity. And so, as a gesture in framing, I'll introduce the program specifically through some images from a photographic series called New Dutch Views by the photographer Marwan Bassiouni. And I give thanks to Marwan for permission to use these images and in the promotion of the program. In developing the first New Dutch Views series, which we see an example of here, Bassiouni visited more than 70 mosques in the Netherlands between January 2018 and February 2019 to produce a set of landscape portraits that are highly strikingly presented in a near one-to-one scale when you see them as physical photographs. Bassiouni treats these studies in a highly technical manner as an investigation of photography, and he has developed his skill over the series in countering the challenges of lighting that tend to produce a sense of collage or discontinuity between the interior and the exterior, the styles of decor of the mosques and the Dutch landscape that they inhabit. However, as this further image from New Dutch Views captures, the Dutch landscape outside pertains not merely to an environment or a landscape, but to a particular system of social contracting, of economic distribution, of brokering of power, and an ideological topos, often known as the polder system. This particular Dutch arrangement of power is inherited from, in fact, pre-industrial accumulations of colonial empire, and has a unique and some might argue particularly smooth passage into the era of neoliberalism. Of course, what is so powerful and striking about Bassiouni's images, what's really haunting upon encountering them in person, is its reversal of the gaze. Where the Dutch New Right discourse emerged with an idée fixe in defining the terms of an Islamic subject and othering it, these images turn course to focus upon the Dutch political landscape itself. And this is something that we will undertake tonight in the hopes of grappling with some of the social, artistic, and cultural formations that we may, by which we may enter into a survivable 21st century in which we're all currently struggling to emerge into. So without further ado, I would like to invite Merijn to introduce some commentary on his book and research, The Rise of the Dutch New Right. Following that, we'll be joined by a Q&A with the very brilliant critic and curator Edwin Nasr, who I'm extremely delighted to host here at Kunstinstituut Melly, an affiliate of Ashkal Alwan in Beirut, as well as the CCA in Berlin, who will be leading a Q&A and a conversation expanding upon these themes. So thank you for joining us. And I think you'll have to start by holding the mic, but we might have a solution at another point.
All right. Yeah, thanks for having me. We just brought out this book on neoliberalism in the Netherlands. So it's sort of it's interesting to go back to this previous book, which is a revised version of my PhD. It was published in Dutch as the conservative Revolt, and in English as the rise of the Dutch New Right. I was actually, I asked them to get some copies here. They just released a paperback, but academic publishing is terrible. They don't even pre-print them anymore. They only you have to order 1 month in advance, and then they print them digitally in very limited editions, and it's, I don't know, it's terrible. So I'm just gonna give you a short overview of what's inside the book. If you're interested in reading it, you can just get a PDF from me or from Vivian, and don't mind about Routledge. Right, so of course the traditional image of the Netherlands is that of a very progressive country, egalitarian, with very libertarian attitudes towards drugs and sex and all that. And of course, in the last decades, that image has radically changed. This is a picture from The Economist some time ago, where the Netherlands really has become part of the avant-garde, let's say, of European right-wing populism. And this is a change that has happened quite sudden. And generally, there isn't that much analysis of how this happened. There is this notion that populism was there. This is kind of the mainstream narrative. There was this kind of spontaneous sentiment among the population, which was then channeled by populist leaders with their charisma, and Dutch politics changed. And for me, this was not a very convincing narrative, because populist parties have never been larger than 1/6 of the electorate in the Netherlands, but somehow they changed the entire way of thinking about politics in the Netherlands. And also, when you start digging into the history, you'll find that anti-immigration politics was there before populism. So there were kind of mainstream politicians critiquing Islam, saying Muslim immigrants are a major threat to Dutch nation, to Dutch values, and Fortuyn, the first to bring populism in the Netherlands, the first to be officially labeled a populist, came years and years after that. But more importantly, when we talk about populism, we think of generally a style of politics, a charismatic style, but we don't think of ideas. Generally, we think, it's even somewhat irrational type of politics. It's just about the gut, a politics of the gut. That's kind of very common analysis. And I wanted to chart something different, the revolt of the mind. So if you start looking at kind of the debates in the 1980s and the 1990s, you see that there were kind of a grouping of right-wing intellectuals that were very dissatisfied with the way the Netherlands was going, and they mobilized against what they saw as a kind of overweening progressive consensus on lots of fronts. So I started charting those intellectuals, what they talked about. It's the Netherlands. It's a very anti-intellectual country. So it's not that they were amazing thinkers and writers, but it's important nonetheless. So it was also about kind of putting the Netherlands in perspective and not looking at it as a kind of an isolated case. And I looked at this kind of histories of ideas of right-wing politics abroad, and more specifically, the books on the New Right. And the New Right is kind of a current in Anglo-American politics that emerged in the 1960s and 1970s. You had the New Left. Those were kind of the student movements, the peace movement, the feminists, the hippies, the Black Power movement, the anti-nuclear movement. All that was the New Left. But in response arose the New Right. Those were kind of the Christian right, the free market right, and kind of the more neoconservative right, that the kind of hawks, as they are called, that were for proponents of an aggressive foreign policy in the United States and also in Great Britain. And the New Right in the US and the UK was already very present in the 1960s and 1970s. It was seen as a very polarizing time back then, and the most famous reference is, of course, from Hunter S. Thompson in his book on Las Vegas. There's this Johnny Depp is played in the movie. He talked about San Francisco in the middle of the 60s was a very special time and place to be a part of. There was a fantastic universal sense that whatever we were doing was right, that we were winning, and that, I think, was the handle, the sense of inevitable victory over the forces of old and evil. We had all the momentum. We were riding the crest of a high and beautiful wave. So now, less than 5 years later, you can go on a steep hill in Las Vegas and look west, and with the right kind of eyes, you can almost see the high water mark, that place where the wave finally broke and rolled back. So there is this kind of right-wing backlash that comes up at the end of the 1960s that he's talking about with Nixon. And the Dutch image is very different. So here we didn't have that. We had, in fact, what was called the endless 1960s. The feeling was that the Netherlands, the 1960s went on into the 1970s and into the 1980s, and kind of the wave just sort of lost momentum, got absorbed in the Dutch mud, but there was never really kind of a strong right-wing counter-tendency that wanted to go back to Christian values, defend kind of traditional gender patterns, or, all those kind of traditional right-wing politics. So there's a quite well-known book about this particularity of the Netherlands, which is called New Babylon in Aanbouw. It's originally an English PhD. If you want to read it, you can just find it online. Building New Babylon. Has an image of Constance, New Babylon in front. And James Kennedy is an American-Dutch historian. And he talked about the role of elites. He said, like, look, you know, everybody has been talking a lot about the social movements of the 1960s and the 1970s, especially kind of the student movement, the young generation, and their effects on the Dutch political system. But if you really want to understand why the 1960s and 70s were so kind of such a dominant force in the Netherlands, and you have to understand this country was very, very traditional in the 1950s, very Christian. There was lots of social control, and then suddenly there was this kind of almost a revolution in the 1960s-70s. Why was this? He pointed to the role of traditional elites. He said, look, you have very specific type of elites and elite culture in the Netherlands, and they don't oppose change. They are not reactionary. They don't want to mobilize some silent majority. They see themselves as the custodians of change. They see themselves as kind of those that channel modernization. And to really understand this, you have to go back to the beginning of the Dutch political system. And the weird thing here is that, unlike other countries, you didn't really have a very powerful labor movement. In fact, the Christian centrist parties became much stronger before the labor movement emerged. And these Christian centrist parties, they saw it as their role to channel modernization, the forces of modernization. They wanted to prevent workers from becoming radicalized and to unite employers and workers, capital and labor under one Christian roof. Their kind of primal instinct was to depoliticize matters and to bring everybody to the center. So this type of political instinct is focused on building consensus and taking away conflict out of society. So they didn't want to polarize things in the 1960s and 1970s. Instead, they spoke about elastic absorption. So if you have a shock, you move with this shock, and then you can absorb the power of that shock. And then in Dutch, you call it also doodknuffelen, to cuddle something to death, you know, which is a very kind of specific Dutch political technique. So this is all, I mean, so this is typical Dutch consensus politics. And if you want to understand how it emerged, I can advise you to read the English edition of this book. But for now, important is that's why there was not kind of a strong conservative counter-reactions in the 1960s and 70s. And what you see is that at a certain point, a lot of people, intellectuals on the right in the Netherlands, and of all the mainstream parties, they were getting very concerned. They were like, at the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 1990s, they were looking at the Netherlands, and then they were looking at Thatcher, and they were looking at Reagan, and something's wrong here. You know, we have had the opportunity to mobilize, to change the country, to get rid of the welfare state, you know, to reinstall some traditional values here, and we haven't used that momentum because our political elite is too attached to consensus. That was the analysis. In fact, they used this image, which I love a lot, of a surplus in our kind of a sprinting game. There's this moment when they start the game that they have to stand still for, I don't know, 1 minute or something, and then they start sprinting. And this guy, you know, Hans Vuijsje, he is a conservative sociologist connected to the Social Democrat Party. They have a very right-wing conservative part too of the party. And they called him Nieuw Flinks. It's a really funny name. But anyway, so he argued, you know, this consensus culture is kind of political correctness that is causing us not to be able to move forward on a lot of issues. And suddenly, he said, in the 1990s, we shifted gears and we started pulverizing these old progressive taboos. And that's kind of the analysis that a lot of people make in the Netherlands. Because you have this consensus system where everybody wants to try and prevent polarization, when change happens, it can happen very quickly because everybody adjusts to the new situation. At least, well, that's James Kennedy's argument, and he says, like, look, you had this sudden change in the 1960s and 70s, and then in the 1990s and 2000s, he saw the same, but then in the opposite direction. Now suddenly people were kind of complaining about, you know, the baby boomers, the 1960s and the 1970s, all the progressive taboos that had led to a country full of immigrants that don't adjust to our values. That was a kind of the conservative critique that was emerging in the 1990s. We need to get rid of this consensus culture to really be able to reinforce Dutch culture and national identity. For me, the main figure in this offensive was Frits Bolkestein, a right-wing liberal leader, later European Commission of the Internal Market. He was a former executive of Shell, ran Shell departments in the Shell department in Indonesia, and he had also been very much formed by the Cold War. He was in Nicaragua for Shell as well, and he said, well, my politics, that's when I realized that you cannot be a neutral businessman. You know, and the importance of dealing with the trade unions. That's in his biography. Right, so this guy is a very international figure for a Dutch politician. So he was very much focused on these American and British conservatives, neoliberals. He read all of them. He interviewed them in his books. And he started popularizing them in the Netherlands. And he started getting this group of people around him to work with him. And he said, like, you know, there's this progressive wave from the 1960s and 70s. He wrote in his first book in 1990. And the wave has gone. It's been absorbed. But it has left lots of residues everywhere. We need to take that out. So you had this kind of, in the 1990s, you had this big critique of the 1970s, of the baby boomers. It was argued that they had abused the Dutch sense of guilt of the Second World War, that the Dutch hadn't prevented the deportation of Dutch Jews, to plead for a generous welfare state and open borders for immigrants. So the problem was that these leftist elites of the 1960s and 1970s were not politically in power anymore, but they dominated the institutions. And this was an analysis that was originally made by US conservatives and also in Great Britain, and was part of the famous American culture wars. And it became a kind of a founding ingredient of the Dutch culture wars as well. And you will find, if you listen to Baudet or Wilders, it's always about the progressives that are dominating the media and the education institutions, and we should get rid of that. So that was the analysis in the 1990s. And Pim Fortuyn, the first official populist, built on that. Already Frits Bolkestein had argued that there was a threat of Muslim immigrants in the Netherlands that needed to be warded off with a kind of resolute defense of Dutch national identity, which he understood to be Christian in origins. So you get this new identity politics that props up around these type of specifically Western identity. Fortuyn took that same inspiration. He built a lot on Bolkestein, also took from Samuel Huntington, the author of The Clash of Civilizations. He introduced himself as the Dutch Samuel Huntington in the Netherlands. And he combined the same kind of currents that you had in the UK and the US. He had a free market philosophy. So he proposed to get rid of all fixed contracts in the Netherlands. Everybody had to go and become an entrepreneur of the self, according to Fortuyn, because else we couldn't withstand global competition. And we had to privatize as much as possible, get rid of the kind of 60% of the bureaucracy, smash the unions. He wanted the Dutch Margaret Thatcher to come in the Netherlands. And he combined that with a kind of conservative cultural narrative. He said, like, in the 1960s, we've got rid of the fathers and the mothers, and we need to get them back in some symbolic way. And he combined that with his critique of Islam. So that was really the kind of... And what you really see is that when Fortuyn, when he got shot and when there was the election victory of his orphaned party, there was this same kind of dynamic happening as did in the 1960s and 1970s. So everybody started accommodating that shift, and you saw like a new post-Fortuyn consensus emerging. In the book, I also look at Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Geert Wilders. Ayaan Hirsi Ali is now a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, one of the more famous conservative and free market think tanks in the United States. And she had been a student in Leiden under Paul Cliteur, one of the head of the think tank of Thierry Baudet, of Forum for Democracy, the radical right party. In the beginning, she was a very close tandem with Geert Wilders, who happens to be the former assistant of Frits Bolkestein. And he's always been very explicit that his main inspiration for his politics was Frits Bolkestein. So, is this new kind of, this right-wing current very much the same as in the US and the UK? No, it's actually, in an important way, it's different. You had this very late emergence of this right-wing current in the Netherlands. It didn't arrive in the 1960s, 1970s, or 1980s. It only really arrived in the 1990s. And what you see is that Pim Fortuyn was, of course, openly homosexual. And they also arrived at a time when it was no longer possible to question dominant values in terms of abortion rights or euthanasia or like all these kind of very typical things that are part of the cultural war still in the United States. They were no longer up for discussion in the Netherlands in the 1990s. So what you see is that there is this kind of conservative politics that says, like, in the 1960s and 1970s, everything has gone wrong, except for, our enlightened values, such as women's rights and gay rights. So you have this very confusing situation where it's right-wing people that are saying, like, look, all these progressive people are cultural relativists. They don't have a notion of the superiority of Western culture. We have. We know that we are superior to all these other people. But, you need this feeling of superiority to be able to defend those progressive values. That's the kind of narrative that emerged. And Ian Buruma, the literary critic, I think, and well-known international author, wrote quite a book very accessible about the death of Theo van Gogh when he got assassinated. And he argued, he interviewed Bolkestein and a lot of these kind of very mainstream figures on the right. And he looks at this very contradictory politics of the right in the Netherlands, where they sort of latched on to the Enlightenment as a kind of part of Dutch identity, instead of some kind of, age-old traditional values or something like that. So, yeah, that was quickly an overview of the book, very confusing, but yeah, just to get the discussion started, I guess.
Thank you, Merijn, for this animated presentation. Vivian told me to remind everyone that we are being video recorded today also. Merijn, I just wanted to maybe start by asking, since this book is very much an intellectual history of the Dutch New Right, if one were to also assign a sort of economic or materialist understanding of who and what is the New Right's sort of constitutive base, who would be a traditional voter of the New Right in the Netherlands in the 2000s, but also today, because based on the postscript that you provide in the book, you also assert that there's been a bit of a shift.
Yeah, I think at the moment it's extremely confusing to say what's now going on, especially because a party of Baudet is now getting into the anti-corona camp, which I don't know, I find it very difficult to analyze that. But Fortuyn is very explicit about what he sees as his electoral base. He talks of himself as the representative of ondernemend Nederland, small entrepreneurs. The petit bourgeoisie is basically, he argues that the Netherlands is in essence a deeply petit bourgeois country. And I want to, you know, get the voice of these people out. And then later, of course, the analysis of the rise of Fortuyn, they point to an alliance between the new rich, de nieuwe rijken, and the mensen in de oude wijken, as they say. So it's the nouveau riche and the people in the old neighborhoods that, especially Rotterdam, is supposed to be the epitome of this. No? The people that once were the working class, when you had a very big port here, but then they became, you know, their income started rising, they started moving to the suburbs, and immigrants started moving into the city center. And that was kind of the beginning of the end for the Social Democrat Party. So they argued like, we are the orphaned people of the Social Democrat Party, but in fact, of course, the Social Democrat Party had been a victim of its own success. There had been an emancipation of the working class in the Netherlands, and the term itself doesn't really resonate that much anymore. And so you had this really kind of, I would say, petit bourgeois suburban mobilization against multiculturalism, against immigration, and against the baby boomer elite, the progressive baby boomers who had made all this possible.
What would be the economic explanation for that?
Well, as I said, you have deindustrialization. So the working class sort of disappears in the Netherlands. You have basically, you could more in sociological terms talk about underemployed or an underclass, but that's small in the Netherlands, it has a large service sector. So you don't have that very strong working class base anymore, or a working class identity that much. It's more fragmented than in a country, say, let's say the UK, where you have a very kind of strong class segmentation in society. That's not the case in the Netherlands. So that's an important material factor that what caused people to vote in the 1960s and 1970s for the left changed when they moved into, became owner occupants, they bought a house, they were in a suburban, they wanted, you know, and they started voting for the right. This is a kind of a movement you see happening in lots of countries. So this is kind of a natural part. And also what you see is that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, most people before that understood politics in socio-economic terms. You know, it's the left versus the right, it's redistribution versus market freedom. That's the kind of the big debate. And if you look at the Dutch newspapers of that era, you know, the economic sections is huge, and a lot of the debates is in the economic section. And then in the 1990s, there's this new consensus. You know, the Cold War is gone. Fukuyama declares the end of history. He says, in the Netherlands, you know, you are the avant-garde of the end of history. You know, we know that ideology has passed away in the Netherlands already for a long time. He said that in 1993. And then you get this new politics of cultural identity, no? where you have Islam becoming the new contender. This is long before 9/11. Huh? So this is already with the first Gulf War. You have American intellectuals saying like, you know, religion is kind of an interesting model of politics. And you have Samuel Huntington coming out with The Clash of Civilizations in 1993. And here in the Netherlands, you have quite a lot of people getting into that discourse, and this becomes the new type of cultural politics, and that's very dominant. So I think it's the disappearance of the major socioeconomic cleavage determining Dutch politics.
You also mention importantly in the book that one needs to also think through the Dutch rightward shift by applying an Anglo-American framework instead of a traditional European one, and that the Dutch really have this Atlanticist outlook that they've had for decades and have really modeled their rightist discourse style and political foundations through the American model. But what would be the main differences, you would say, in regards to the Dutch right, beyond the fact that it is more secularized, let's say?
Yeah, well, I think it's also more marginal. So, like the major difference, of course, is also the political system in the Netherlands being much more divided. So you don't have a kind of conservative bloc versus a progressive bloc as you have in the UK or the US. It's called the Westminster model. But you have this endless fragmentations of different parties. And it used to be that you had three main currents. You had the Christian Democrats, you had the Social Democrats, and then you had the right-wing liberals. And that creates a completely different situation for the right. The Christian Democrats, because they also had a progressive wing, they never wanted to get in bed with conservatism. They always, you know, they maintained lots of distance to the label, and they thought it was far too polarizing, the kind of Anglo-American conservatism. So for them, you get these books by Dutch authors on conservatism. It always means moderation, you know, keeping things ordered and not getting too far ahead with strange ideas. You know, whereas in the US, if you talk about conservatism, you think of you know, the Republican Party, and or you think of a Thatcher. Now, kind of what the Conservatives are doing in Britain, it's not moderation. You know, it's actually pretty radical politics at times. So that never landed very well in the Netherlands. And what you see is that when I described this kind of Anglo-American influence in the 1990s, but that really arrived when the Dutch party system was collapsing. So the Christian Democrats, they lost a lot of seats, and they're almost gone now, basically. But they used to be the most powerful force in Dutch politics. You know, Dutch political culture, you cannot understand anything if you don't understand the Christian Democrats, and they're very difficult to understand because they're continuously saying different things, and you know, it's just. So that disappeared, and then they started. You know, people on the right were like, "Yeah, we can get some of that voter base by you know, putting a more kind of the polarization on," and that has happened since then. A lot. It worked. There's a lot of momentum on the right-wing flank of Dutch politics. And you see still this kind of traditional Christian democratic politics to accommodate that. Yeah. You see it also in other countries, but very much so in the Netherlands. They even explicitly say so. There are some people on the right that said, like, after Fortuyn got elected, we need to. Fortuyn has sown the seeds. We need to reap the harvest. That's what they said in the Christian Democrat Party. So that makes this kind of very strange centrist politics very accommodating, and this marginal but powerful radical right is very typical of the Netherlands, I think.
But you also mentioned, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the Christian Democrats were sort of the reason for which there never really was, up until the 90s, radical right formations in the Netherlands, contrary to other European countries. But somehow, when the new right came into power and the Christian Democrats got their hegemony sort of kicked in the back, that changed. But what I find interesting about the Dutch new right is that it never, because it didn't particularly come from a post-fascist context in a way, contrary to other contexts and situations such as in France or Italy, it always also wanted to sort of distantiate itself from other European far-right parties. Why is that?
Yeah, so you had a Dutch extreme right and the Centrum Democrats in the 1980s, 1990s. They were a very marginal force, and what they were saying was largely taboo. So the Dutch, the national self-image has much been built on the experience of the Second World War. So to be kind of, espousing these extreme right ideas was sort of seen as something anti-Dutch, something that doesn't belong to our national identity, and that should be stamped out, really. And that was kind of the response. And I think this Anglo-American influence has been very important because people like Bolkestein and Fortuyn were very good in intellectually distancing themselves from that. They said, like, it's not about race. It's about culture, and it's not that we dislike Muslims because they have brown skin or any kind of those racial categories, but it's their culture. And the problem with their culture, it's unreformable. It's like Islam cannot do anything about reforming that. So the thing is, they sort of racialize Islam, and it becomes this. It has this almost the same solidity as race. But if you're talking about the politics of culture, it's much more politically acceptable. And what you saw is that both Bolkestein and Fortuyn were attacked from all sides for being too extreme and racist. But they could say, like, we're not like the extreme right. We don't talk about, and they were also very much pro-Israel. This is also like the U.S. neoconservatives. They painted this kind of global war with Islam, and of course Israel was an ally in that war. That was kind of the new constellation. And the same with Fortuyn. He had this little book, 50 Years Israel, how long will it last? And so that's a kind of an important change on the right. So if Fortuyn had a kind of a traditional extreme right rhetoric, he would never have been able to get that much votes, because that's still something that's seen as very alien to, and also extremely dangerous. But kind of the more cultural rhetoric became very normalized. So you already have Wilders in 2007 talking about replacement theory, basically saying, there's a European elite that has made a pact with the oil-producing countries to replace the European population with Muslim immigrants. And that was already there in 2007, and now, of course, replacement theory is very controversial because it's linked to the extreme right. But back then, everybody was like, yeah, okay, freedom of speech, So that's really remarkable.
This is already like here we can already notice a shift, like a Europeanization of this right-wing discourse, because the replacement theory is essentially a very French far-right theory. La théorie du grand remplacement is very much a 90s French sort of intellectual trajectory that made its way to the rest of Europe. And this was my next question. In a sense, your book really focuses on Geert Wilders and Pim Fortuyn and Hirsi Ali and the sort of, let's say, the political generation that came out of the late 90s into the 2000s. But would you consider there to be a sort of theoretical break with now the emergence of someone like Thierry Baudet? Even though I don't know if I would call it emergence because he's already on self-destruction mode, but there is, in a way, because of this added element of Euroscepticism that is much more in alignment with the Front National in France or other traditional far-right parties. Would you use a different framework to explain this new development in far-right politics?
Yeah, so I mean, you get this kind of what in the Netherlands you could call Fortuynism, or this kind of cultural identity politics on the right. It became very dominant to the point where, you know, even the Social Democrat Timmermans, who is now leading the European Green Deal, was kind of espousing the clash of civilizations, and you had the Christian Democrats getting into Huntington, and the right-wing liberals talking about the Islamic threat to her daughter. This was like one of the aspiring leaders of the right-wing liberal party. So this discourse became very mainstream at a certain point, and you saw at the same time that to maintain a kind of distinctive edge, you saw a process of radicalization, both with Wilders and with Baudet. And I would say at Wilders, it's kind of more a rhetorical radicalization. You know, it's whereas before it was, you know, we were in emergency mode. Now it was already, you know, Europe is threatening to collapse into civil war. He's always talking about civil war, and he's talking about the elite as traitors, and this is a kind of radicalization in the rhetoric of Wilders. And the point is, people always take that with a large grain of salt. But with Baudet, you see that he's also intellectually taking from another tradition. He's much more focused on the continental European tradition. And that, of course, is also due to the influence of the global alt-right. So with Trump, you had this big alt-right movement online, and they started recycling a lot of those traditional extreme right ideas. And Baudet is very much part of that movement, and I would say that he's more in the extreme right than in the radical right. But I find it very difficult to see consistency in his politics, you know. And it's also become a business model for him. This is, for me, the most convincing way to still think of Baudet as a kind of a rational actor. You know, he's selling books. He earns, I think, $1 million a year. He has a nice family. Just called his kid Lancelot. It's just, I know he's living the life, and it's kind of a grifter. I don't see him that much. And in the beginning, I saw him much more as a figure that would be able to sort of pose a threat to mainstream politics in the Netherlands. That has largely disappeared. Instead, it's Wilders who is still the kind of the most powerful force, kind of radical right-wing populism in the Netherlands.
And before I open this up to the public, I wanted to maybe ask you also. So you mentioned that because Fortuyn and others had very consciously sort of shifted the conversation from race towards culture, I also noticed a sort of absence in the book of questions that pertain to, you know, processes of racialization in the Netherlands, or how the new right may perceive questions of racism as well. I wanted to maybe just ask, how could your analysis of the Dutch new right, how could it accommodate, for example, or how could it make space for, let's say, other contributions by, for example, black feminist thinkers like Gloria Wekker, who speak of white innocence? How can we make sense of the Dutch new right from a racial and or post-colonial lens, in your opinion? can we speak of a sort of white revanchism within the voter base of the Dutch New Right? Because the Netherlands is a perpetrator country, and it does carry a post-colonial legacy to it, but that's largely absent from the debates. Not only from your book, it's not a critique; it's an observation also that this doesn't get mobilized too much, anyways.
Yeah, no, I mean, I wouldn't say that there is no argument about racialization in the book, because it talks about this cultural politics as a form of racialization. You know, if it becomes very monolithic, the idea of culture, if you understand it as something static, something that will never change, it becomes like race. That's one of the points I make in the book. But the whole kind of colonial archive in the Netherlands, I haven't really included that in the analysis. And I think Gloria Wecker's notion of Dutch innocence, I think it's very pertinent and completely right. And it has to do with the Dutch colonial power and how it legitimized itself internationally. So the Dutch, actually from the 17th century onwards, always said, starting actually with Hugo de Groot already, Grotius in Latin, painted itself as the non-aggressive force in the colonial system. We were kind of the neutral small country that wanted to maintain a kind of, healthy balance. This has always been the view. It's also part of why kind of we have in The Hague, the International Peace Palace, or how it's called in English, I don't know. So I'm just directly translating from the Dutch name. So this is a very kind of dominant. So because the Netherlands didn't have that large of a colonial army, it always thought that it would be better, if it painted itself as a neutral arbiter. And that image of the Netherlands as a non-aggressive colonizer got picked up in the 20th century again, and it also has very much connected to the idea that the Dutch cannot be racist. And one of the books I discuss on political correctness by Herman Fuijsje, where he talks about political correctness in the 1990s, which is kind of the precursor to what is now called woke. He says, the Dutch are in essence not a racist people. We are very egalitarian in our ways, and therefore kind of you have this taboo on talking about immigration in the Netherlands because we want to be anti-racist, but we all are already in essence anti-racist. So we can talk about all the problems of multiculturalism without having to fear racism. And that was the same point that Fortuyn was making in the 1990s. Actually, it's very interesting if you read Fortuyn. He's a kind of a free speech absolutist, I would say. So he's arguing that speaking up, even if you're like saying racist things, if you start having a conversation with each other and you get it all out, then the racism is gone as well, And so he's saying, he's in the 1990s, he's saying, yeah, you get it out of your system. So you don't. We should just get rid of the taboo. We should also get rid of the first article of the Constitution, which is preventing discrimination on the basis of race, religion, sex. We should just get it all out, and then there's this belief not only in Dutch innocence, but also in a kind of a horizontality of the discursive space, as academics would call it. But there's everybody is on equal footing when we are talking to each other. And this is a very dominant idea by Dutch free speech advocates. Also in the Bali in Amsterdam, this is the post-Fortuynist vision that's very much there. So that's all connected, I think, to that colonial image of the Netherlands.
But do you think that now that this sort of image of the Netherlands as a non-aggressive colonizer is coming to an end, also within the mainstream, the government has announced that it would also, for example, reserve quite a chunk to providing, to formally apologize for the slave trade and to provide some public education on the matter and Dutch involvement in the slave trades. Do you think that this memory work will be weaponized in the future by the right, the way it has a long time ago in France, for example, with the right speaking of the fact that they want to get rid of this guilt that is being forced on them by elites for colonization, or the way in which the Germans also do it in regards to the Holocaust with the AfD, wanting to clear themselves of, having to continue paying reparations for Jews. Can you imagine this sort of getting articulated somehow in the Netherlands, even though it's not completely...
Well, it was, in the book I showed that it's the debate in the 1990s all about this, about the progressive guilt surrounding World War II and the Holocaust that has made us in a far too leftist country, which is much too accommodating towards immigrants. And what you see afterwards is kind of the endless repetition of these tropes. So I think it's already back. It's already here, and it's gonna continue. I mean, it's been 20 years since these first books about, and if you read those books, it's amazingly repetitive. And there's this massive, we forget that we've been having the same debate for over 20 years, and then people start getting into it again. So I don't think there will be a resolution of this ever. But I think, the mainstream opinion on this is moving, and I think that has a lot to do with the kind of historical work and activist work that has been done in recent years.
How are we with time? Should we move on to the audience questions? Yes.
Hi, thank you both, and thank you, Melly, for organizing this. I had a question about another term that was absent in general from your talk, which seems to be absent because it's literally what the entire thing is about, which is liberalism. And it seems to me that in the Dutch context, like the progressive movement and the right are actually fighting over what liberalism means, as opposed to other contexts where the right might actually be trying to get rid of liberalism, and the left might be trying to get rid of liberalism, and there is this kind of centrist ground which is still trying to hold on to a political and economic form of liberalism. So I wonder if that, I'm sure it plays a part in your book, but I was wondering if you could say something to that.
Yeah, wow. Well, you should understand that actually liberalism was a marginal force in Dutch politics until the 1990s. So liberals were very dominant at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, but as soon as you had mass politics, as you had the franchise, liberalism was like in decline. And after the Second World War, they were like sort of desperate, they were like, okay, we have people in all of the major corporations, but we have no base. So the Christian Democrats really started dominating that, and they had a very different type of discourse, which was all about social responsibility. The social responsibility of Dutch workers to moderate, to keep their wage claims low, so the Netherlands remains competitive, and the social responsibility of employers to not be too greedy and to, work with the system. So that's kind of the basis of Dutch corporatism, and what is later called the Polder model. So that's not very liberal in a sense. So the liberalism really, when the Netherlands starts understanding itself as a liberal country in the 1990s, but also it's always filled with remorse. When the Netherlands talks about individualism, there's this pang of regret about the loss of community. So that's I wouldn't say the Netherlands is kind of happy about being a liberal country, but that has to do with kind of the particular history of the Netherlands. And I think you still have a dominant liberal tradition, also with the VVD, of course, being the dominant party. and the population has been liberalized in a sense, you know. People started owning homes, started becoming financially independent, and started voting after their interests. And this is what Fortuyn calls, you know, the emancipation of the people. And he said, well, you know, people are now liberal individuals, and they no longer need the welfare state. They no longer need Dutch elites. We can fix it on our own. And so you have a very dominant, this type of liberal politics. You can also see it with Mark Rutte, where you have this constant thing where the political elite sort of outsources initiative to the people themselves. So our our pandemic response is basically the government telling the people, you should take better care of yourselves. And this is a political technique that works very well, because if you're kind of a centralized government like in France and you're doing everything, then you're also accountable for all those actions. But if you say, like, you know, the success of our pandemic strategy largely depends on your voluntary initiative, and I'm not going to give you any specific instructions on how to take that, but I will later chastise you for having done the wrong thing. That's great as a political strategy. It works very well. So yeah, we're still a liberal country. I don't know if this really answers your question. I need, I think, a long time period to talk really about Dutch liberalism.
Yeah, my question is almost symmetrical to yours, and it concerns Marxism and the fact that Pim Fortuyn was a Marxist in his past, Marxist sociologist, which strikes me as an interesting parallel also to the American neoconservatives, many of whom were ex-Marxist or ex-Trotskyites. So how do we make sense of that? How does it fit? Did he just turn from a Marxist to a neoliberal, or maybe, that's my question, is it a certain school of Marxism that also had this ingrained notion of cultural superiority from a kind of Hegelian heritage? I mean, something that we also see, for example, with the way how the Dutch Socialist Party positions itself, which takes partly very reactionary and even populist, even right-wing populist stances. So that this kind of cultural chauvinism was maybe something that is could be a constant in the biography of both the American neoconservatives and an ex-Marxist like Fortuyn.
Yeah, no, I think there is certainly something to be said for, like, the centrality of this figure of the left-wing convert, or better to call it the right-wing convert, and, you know, someone that was left-wing and then turned to the right. It was not only Pim Fortuyn, but a lot of people of his generation started getting into politics as student radicals, and then when they became somewhat older and started, you know, having a family and having a house, getting a bit more settled, and getting up the career ladder, they became right-wing figures. You know, I think it's also something that worked with the time. When in the 1970s, Fortuyn got a position at Groningen University because he was a Marxist. You know, that was the way to go if you were a young academic. And then in the 1990s, you know, if you were not a conservative critic of multiculturalism and progressive baby boomers, that was the way to go again. So I think he's just moving with the mainstream currents of the time, and if you look theoretically at that, there is, Fortuyn's Marxism, there's no theoretical texts of Fortuyn. He has published his PhD on post-war economic policy. It's profoundly empirical. There's not a trace of Marxism anywhere in there. So his Marxism is purely kind of a symbolic thing, but it's not in his work. So I wouldn't call him an intellectually a Marxist. He was kind of someone with Marxist sympathies, and then he became already a social democrat in the 1970s. So I wouldn't really stick too much on that.
Any further questions, or maybe Edwin can continue.
Maybe I could ask a question or two pertaining to art and culture. Since perhaps one of the most formative contributions of the New Right has been the, and you say so yourself in a blog post that I read by yours from dating from 2010, is actually the culture cuts. Would you consider that to be also a centerpiece to the contribution, the joyous, traumatizing contributions that the New Right has offered this country within the last 20 years as well?
Yeah. No, I think this was very central. Like, if you think, of course, there's these progressive elites in the media, in the cultural sector, and at the universities. You want to annoy them, and also it's electorally very beneficial to annoy them. You know, you can score points with certain parts of the right-wing electorate, and it's also very a core element of how the right thinks in the Netherlands is you know, that the welfare state and progressive elites are constantly telling people what they should like and what they should want. And the social democrat cultural policy was very much about emancipating the working class by making culture generally accessible and easily affordable. So, and one of the things, one of the legacies of that is that the Dutch art scene is not very kind of hierarchical in terms of class. You know, in other countries it's much more difficult to become an artist. You have to you need to be from a very well-off family. And here in the Netherlands, actually, you were subsidized to become an artist, and you know, you had this system where you could get subsidized art in a local neighborhood center. So that was all the entire idea of the left, was like we should, the ultimate ideal of politics is to emancipate people from their kind of, you know, basic economic needs and to fulfill the kind of those upper needs. And at the top was culture. That was a kind of a notion of the left. And on the right, this was like terrible, you know, it was like, you have these liberal elites telling you that you should get culturally formed or educated, or you know, that you should get into culture, and this is paid by tax-paying people. That's the worst of it. So this was a very kind of important reference point for Bolkestein, and he has a few texts that are really amazing. Which is also based on the American neoconservatives. This is in the beginning of the 2000s. He has this lecture where he talks about the counterculture. So there's the counterculture of the 1960s and 1970s. Irving Kristol, the famous American neoconservative, wrote about that. And this had the major center of this counterculture was the arts and the cultural sector, and it was perverting the youth. And there was this cultural avant-garde, which is now the theory of cultural Marxism is quite close to that. But it had this notion from the avant-garde aesthetic to, you know, to continually progress, to critique and to advance. And what the neoconservatives in the US said, you know, this is degrading and corrosive of culture. We should get rid of that type of people in our cultural institutions. And Bolkestein said the same thing. You know, he had a big lecture in Leiden where he basically claimed that the art institutes were damaging Dutch national culture and eroding our identity. So you can, and actually his wife was a prominent theater maker, so it's unclear how this relates to his personal situation, but they've been pretty much obsessed with the cultural sector for a very long time, and also, I think also really implying that its effect on Dutch culture is extremely large. You know, you would almost think, wow, that's, you know, it's almost a positive view, because in that sense you can really dictate the terms of Dutch culture from your art institution. I would be a bit more moderate in that sense.
But do you think also this these cuts were only theoretically sort of put in place as a response to the cultural sector at large, or was it also, you think, a targeted attack? Because you do mention the fact that these cuts actually, in a sense, end up punishing small experimental spaces in a way. And in the 2000s, there have been a wealth of practices that were more, that came out of the Netherlands that were more sort of discursive, directly politicized. They were addressing the new right. There were programs at the Van Abe called Becoming Dutch. There was the Citizens and Subjects pavilion at the 2007 Venice Biennial, I think, that Maria Labaiova, who's with us here, curated. Do you feel like this was, in a way, a pet peeve of the new right that they've wanted to get rid of very directly?
I don't think they were extremely informed about the art scene. You know, like what was this, Zijlstra? You know, or like he was very open about not knowing anything about culture. You know, and he also made that a token of pride. I don't know shit about art, and I think nobody is supposed to know anything. You know, he was this kind of very proud nihilist, so I don't think they were reacting. It's very much more that they were like, this was an easy target, and this was a popular target. You know, so then they have been. They're very interested in kind of specific sectors, you know, their view of politics, especially the neoconservative view, is to see culture as a kind of a dominant thing. So you have the Marxist view where it's economic factors that determine the development of a certain society. Where the conservatives argue is like, well, that's wrong, because it's ultimately it's culture that is the deciding factor in the development of a society. So they're very concerned, and they think that, you know, values and these kind of non-economic things are what keep a society together. So if you have community and these values and you instill them in people, then things will go right. But the problem, of course, is the people that are in those institutions that are instilling the values are the wrong people. They're progressives. They don't instill traditional values. So you have all these people in the US, but also in the Netherlands, complaining all the time about the cultural institutions, the education institutions. So I think that's much more why their peeve is. It's not that because they're extremely knowledgeable about the cultural scene, but because the conservative worldview sees culture as important, even though in practice, you know, they're not extremely knowledgeable about it.
Can I just ask a quick question? Like, is that the reason why now the right seems to be like the only kind of political flank that's really has a kind of obsession with art and culture, like Baudet making claims about the modern architecture and the city, and walking through the chambers of the Tweede Kamer, commenting on all the art that's been purchased in recent years, and yeah, from the left there's almost no. The right is really instrumentalizing art and culture, whereas the left is mostly like silent about these kinds of things.
Yeah, because I mean, I think the old progressive or left-wing cultural politics is gone. You know, that was something from the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. And there was also a certain paternalism to it. That's true. You know, that they were. It's like, you know, let's get those poor proletarians. They can get some waff of the higher things in life, and then they can go for free to the museum, or they can participate in the evening program here and there. So I mean, so from the 1970s, 1980s onwards, you have this kind of thing where that vision, emancipatory idea of culture as a kind of the ultimate, where you want to be in life as a human being is the ultimate thing is to be taking part in culture and in intellectual debates or developing yourself on that level. So I think the conservatives have taken some of that, but with a different twist. So they think culture is very much important in forming, in creating a segmented society, where everybody knows their place, women know their place, but also you have the lower and the higher classes, and it's very important to show that as you are an elite, that you are into higher culture, that you're into playing piano, what Baudet does at the start of his campaign, that you've read the classics. So that's, and then this kind of more modern art and all these kind of things, they are seen as threatening to identity. And so the conservatives, they politicize art and culture in a very different way than the left. And I think the left-wing vision has somewhat disappeared, and it's the mainstream idea is much more art shouldn't be political, and we're not gonna make it into a political thing, but because also then if you really start making it into a political thing, the electorate will probably not care that much about it.
Thank you, Merijn, for this fascinating thoughts. I just want to look at this moment in history. So it sounds dramatic, but it is. And zoom out perhaps a bit to see the situation and politics in the Netherlands in larger context at this very moment. I wonder about the reliability of the terms left and right. Are they useful for the conversation today? And I ask it because of the research into fascism, which I've been engaging for a couple of years, which something one should be doing, although I don't recommend it because it's really tough. And of course, specifically with the war the Russian war on Ukraine, the notion of fascism is undertaking so many changes and needs to. And so if you zoom out from the Netherlands, I don't know whether we would talk about the Dutch politics in the context of dramatic resurgences of fascism as, whether we would call it right-wing politics. Maybe extreme center, Tariq Ali's term from 2015. I wonder what you think about it. That's one thing. So reliability of left, right, center in the current moment of politics, that's one thing. And the other, whether you would observe, if we retain the terminology of left and right, that somehow today left and right swap their constituencies. I have a feeling that left is obsessively busy with identity politics, and the right with class.
Okay. Right. It's interesting that you use left and right in your second question. Well, in your first question, wondering whether those are pertinent at all. I think I'm kind of a social constructivist on left and right. I don't think that they have a kind of an inherent, kind of a stable meaning over time, but people just use it to organize the political landscape. They just look and they talk about left and right, and what left and right means changes during the time. So left and right used to be kind of a socio-economic thing until the 1980s, and in the 1990s, when this whole debate about multiculturalism and Dutch identity started, it suddenly became a cultural thing. So now if we think of the left, people talk about D66, the let's say progressive liberal party, which has quite a right-wing economic program, but they are seen as the left. Even Baudet calls them part of the the World Economic Forum that's out there to dominate the world, and that's already an indication, you know, where that this cultural view is becoming very dominant, because the World Economic Forum, who should be there, like big business, you know, traditionally conceived of as the right, but in the kind of extreme conspiracy theories now going around, those are the people that want to install the Great Reset. You know, I don't know if you've guys heard of that. It's Klaus Schwab, a neoliberal, you know, who with the World Economic Forum, with all the major companies, wants to install a socialist policy to get the world ready for climate change. And, well, actually not only socialist, but kind of a totalitarian society. So I think left and right will always continue to be important, but they will change the meaning. And I think it's really, for me, that this kind of very cultural way of understanding the world, it's really annoying, because you cannot understand the real power relations. You know, as soon as we start seeing the World Economic Forum as left-wing actors, for me it becomes very strange. I can't understand anything anymore. So if they're in power, why are we not doing anything about climate change? You know, it's pretty much a failed conspiracy. It's really weird. About your second question about changing parts, changing demographics, or like changing support bases, I think it's not really like there's this narrative about the working class voting for Trump and the working class voting for the right, and I think it's a very confusing narrative, because if you look, this was a kind of a thing that a lot of people said when Trump got elected, is like, look at who voted for Trump. The coalition behind Trump is they have a lot more money generally per person than the Democratic coalition. The Democratic coalition was poorer, but there was kind of a sizable part of the Trump electorate that were kind of the white working class, but it's like a really small segment, like 5%, or even less, but they tipped the scale. And the white working class in very specific regions of American politics, because that's the crazy system in the United States, that it's a few states that really tip the scales of any kind of electoral system. So that's why the white working class became such a dominant narrative after Trump. It's not that he got that many of the white working class voters, but they made the difference. And in Europe, you have, of course, in the UK, a very prominent example of the Red Wall and the kind of more culturally conservative working class voters voting for the Tories. And I think that part is true, that you have, it's a very kind of cliche almost in political science and sociology, is that there's a lot of working class people, or people that are economically on the lower echelons of the pay scale, with very conservative sentiments. And the major idea of starting a culture war, if you're a right-wing politician, is that if everybody talks about culture all the time, then these people will decide to vote not because of their economic motives on the left, but they will vote out of their cultural motives on the right. That's what you want. And I think that in that sense it's true, but we should not kind of overestimate the kind of switch that has taken place. And I think we should also be very aware that we're not calling black working class people, not working class because they happen to be black. You have this racialization of what we think of as working class, and we are not considering that what we would call the working class in this country are for a large part migrants, or people with migrant origins.
Thank you. I think, okay, so final question then for the evening goes to the one and only director of Kunstinstituut, Melly. Thank you.
Thank you. A very interesting conversation, and I want to follow up the discussion around class and identity with the one of that has been very much written about as of late in the United States, particularly in the New York Times, around the crisis of meritocracy that is happening. And I was wondering if you could speak to the place that meritocracy, if at all, has within the landscape of Dutch politics, because a lot of it is not based on just a general idea. I mean, a lot of the discussion is not based on a general idea of culture or access to culture or identity politics as such, but the way in which the so-called social development has happened through education and access to education, and from a kind of manual labor to knowledge production. And that a lot of the debates, particularly as it pertains in the United States to the crisis of populism that we have right now, or the rise of populism, is that meritocracy, which was one of the most wished for and ethically approved kind of social ladders, that through your hard work and study, you would actually be able to change your own working conditions. That was very much favored, very much aligned to, again, education and not necessarily culture at large in terms of, say, art institutions or the culture industry of Hollywood and such. But here there is no discussion of it at all in my experience. And in fact, what I kind of get a sense is more and more, not only through my reading of the kind of crisis of meritocracy as being a value, and the critique of that is being that even if a lot of people have become much more professionalized, have much more education, there is no social change. There is no more access to either wealth or opportunities or whatever you want. So that's the discussion there, which I'm very much following. But at the same time, even though meritocracy has been very much one of the kind of working ethics that a lot of people in the Global South, I would say, have aspired for, here, when there is a discussion around politics or identity, politics or culture, or even the right and left, never a single mention of that. And so my question is, where does meritocracy sit within the political landscape that you have studied or that you envision, where where work, professionalism, education are not necessarily associated to a specific ideology politically in terms of the right or left, whether it's through Geert Wilders or Marxism or through Baudet and the D66.
Okay, thanks. That's a difficult question. Yeah, I think there is a prominent narrative in the Netherlands that the rise of right-wing populism is actually a revolt against meritocracy.
It's in the United States, it's the same.
Yeah.
That's the theories that are being promoted.
Yeah, so there's Mark Bovens, a kind of prominent professor here that has developed this story for the Netherlands. And of course they all cite Michael Young and the dystopian book about meritocracy, and basic argument is like, you know, if we really started dishing out kind of benefits and income according to merit, then there's people that are, you know, less gifted in certain ways, and they will get less, and they will become very resentful, and they will start voting for right-wing populist parties, and it's probably also for budget cuts on the arts. That's kind of the argument, and I don't know if that's really the core of the drive behind right-wing populism. I don't think so. I think also a lot of these people are economically quite successful, so you have a lot of small entrepreneurs that have a lot of economic capital, but not a lot of cultural capital. That's a big part of the voter base for the radical right and also the center right. So these people don't really care that much about culture, and they don't really believe in the need to have it to be economically successful. So there's that. And on the other end, I think the whole debate around wokeness and especially positive discrimination is a debate on meritocracy. So if you are someone who happens to be not white in the Netherlands and you have an education and then you want to enter the institutions and you find it's very difficult if you have the wrong name or the wrong skin color, you will, of course, plead for more positive discrimination. And you will use meritocracy, you know, to your advantage. And then the right, they go the other way around. They also defend meritocracy. They just understand it in a very different way. They just say, like, you know, we are inherently non-racist people. This is like the given order that is there now is already a meritocratic order, you know. So it's a debate that is taking place within meritocratic ideology, and it's not contesting that. So, and I think that that's gonna remain a very important thing. I mean, I posted something on Twitter a week ago or something about that universities in the Netherlands, there's only 1/4 of the professors are actually women. And at the same time, we have a Minister of Justice that is saying that Dutch universities are bulwarks of woke ideology, you know? So I would say, like, if you have only, you know, 1 in 3 is a woman, then it's a bulwark of patriarchy, you know? And that would be a more factual statement to make. So that's kind of a thing. I think meritocracy is absolutely dominant in the Netherlands, but people make their own kind of politically convenient interpretation of what meritocracy is.
Thank you so much, Merijn. And with that, I would like to, we end on the Dutch petty bourgeois and the resentment uniquely of the Dutch petty bourgeois. And I will have for a long time the term doodknuffelen in my pocket as a very useful Dutch-specific political concept. But thank you so much for bringing a really rich, dynamic, and rigorous conversation here to Kunstinstituut. Melly, thank you so much, Edwin, for steering us through some of the finer points in teasing out Dutch specifics relative to our neighbors in France and elsewhere in Europe. Thank you, everyone, for being here. There will now be a service of Prosecco. To continue the conversation, please be welcome to spend some more time with us this evening as well. Thank you.